Hey, I'm Josh Fosgreen for BaseBuzz.com, and if you're feeling confused about right hand and thumb technique, look no further. Whether you're a beginner and you're not sure which technique to learn, or if you're more experienced and you're wondering if you're doing the right technique, stick around and we're going to create some clarity and increased understanding for you on this topic so that you can move forward with your playing. The first technique I want to describe to you, I'm going to call the movable anchor technique. And so this is where I'm using my thumb as an anchor to kind of give my right hand a feeling of stability. And I'm going to either rest it on the pickup when I'm playing on my lowest string, which on a 4-string bass is the E string. And then if I'm not using the E string, I'm going to rest my thumb there. And sometimes I might even bring my thumb all the way to the A string if I'm only using the D and G strings for a passage. Okay, so my thumb could be on the neck pickup, the bridge pickup, all the way over here on the fingerboard. That'll give me some different tonal options, but those would all be encompassed within what I'm calling movable anchor. Okay, so thumb on the fingerboard, thumb on the neck pickup, thumb on the bridge pickup, and then moving around depending on musical context. That is what I'm calling the movable anchor technique. Next is the static anchor, which again, the thumb could be on the fingerboard, neck pickup, or bridge pickup. But in this case, as implied by the name static anchor, you're going to leave your thumb there all the time. So no matter what you're playing, your thumb's just going to stay on the same spot on the pickup and not move to the strings. Okay, that's what I'm calling static anchor. The next technique we're going to talk about is the floating thumb technique, which was invented by the bass player Gary Willis, okay? And from here on out, I'm going to refer to that sometimes as the Willis technique too, just for clarity. And this technique, full disclaimer, this is not a technique that I use, so I'm just going off of Gary Willis's instructional materials. It's not something that I've really honed and perfected on my own over time. Basically, instead of anchoring the thumb somewhere and then pivoting the fingers around, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a much straighter wrist angle, and I'm going to let my thumb follow my fingers. As I move across the neck. And my demonstration here is very imprecise, but that's basically, when I use the phrase floating thumb, I'm referring to Gary Willis's very unique right hand approach of when you're on the E string, your thumb's just hovering here, and then when you're on the A string, your thumb's kind of hovering on the E string, basically sliding along with you. Now there's some other stuff that comes with Gary Willis's technical instruction. We're just talking about thumb position here, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a second. So, floating thumb, invented by Gary Willis, very straight wrist angle, and the thumb moves along with the fingers as you cross the strings for plucking. The last technique I'm going to define here, I'm going to call floating hand, and this I hear people talking about sometimes on forums too, which is where your thumb is not anchored to anything. Now this is where there can be a lot of terminology confusion. When people say floating thumb, it sounds like your thumb's not touching anything, but really with the floating thumb technique as invented by Gary Willis, your thumb is actually in contact with the strings almost all the time. But it's floating between different strings. So here I'm going to define a technique, floating hand, where my thumb's actually not anchored to anything. So I might anchor with my forearm back here on the bass. Okay, so I'm going to call that floating hand. My thumb is actually floating and not touching the bass at all. So those are the 4 techniques that we're going to talk about today. Movable anchor, the thumb can move from the pickup to the E or A string. Static anchor, thumb's always on the pickup. Floating thumb, the Gary Willis technique, where the thumb follows along with the plucking fingers and the wrist is very straight. And the floating hand technique, where you can have a forearm anchor, but maybe even not a forearm anchor, and the thumb is definitely not touching anything. Okay, those are our 4 techniques for discussion today. Now we've defined our terms and we're ready to actually talk about these techniques and what the pros and cons are and stuff. So I'm going to start by talking about the movable anchor technique. This is the technique that's used by 90+% of the professional famous bass players that I've seen video of, okay? Jaco Pastorius, Victor Wooten, Marcus Miller, Stanley Clarke, Les Claypool, Flea. The list goes on and on and on. You can see more of that list in the article. If you're watching this on YouTube, click the link in the description. You can check out the article with a long, long list of these bass players that you've heard their names. They're very famous. Richard Bona, Adrian Farode, just tons of people, legendary bassists from decades ago, contemporary bassists who are playing now, all use this movable anchor technique. And this is also what I primarily use and what I teach to my students. So I have a little bit of a subjective bias here. I just want to make that clear. There's some objective criteria we can talk about, but I also just have a special soft spot in my heart for this technique. But like I said, this is what I see the bass players that I look up to using, like most of the time when they're playing fingerstyle, this is what they're doing. And I do see some slight variations in the approach to the technique, but they're very slight. For example, one bass player might be 50% more likely to move the thumb from the pickup to the E string for a particular passage, while another bass player might choose to just leave the thumb on the pickup because they're going to come back to the E string in a bar or something. So there's not a 100% consistent rule with when the movable anchor actually moves, I've noticed, but I do notice a very consistent pattern of it moving around. There are very few professional bass players that I could find a video of where I couldn't catch their thumb moving at least once. I think out of the 40 or 50 I looked up, maybe Verdine White from Earth, Wind & Fire was the only guy I could find who actually kept his thumb on the pickup the whole time. So what I don't see, and for all I know, he moves it to the E string other times. So what I really don't see happening commonly is the static anchor technique that I hear talked about on bass forums, where your thumb's always resting on the pickup and never moving even to the E string when you're playing on the higher strings. I just don't see that being used. And I think the reason for that is that having the thumb on the E string, if you're not using your E string, or whatever your low string is if you have more strings, it just makes sense. It's the easiest way to mute your E string when you don't want it ringing, because your thumb's got to rest somewhere, and it just seems to be the case that most professional bassists find it natural to just move the thumb on down, because it's a very small move and it's easy to just kind of move it around depending on what you're playing and move it back and forth throughout a passage of music. So I don't see the static anchor technique being used. I really recommend movable anchor over static anchor for sure. What I also don't see people doing is that floating hand technique I talked about, where the thumb isn't anchored at all. And again, this is just me theorizing about the reason behind what I'm observing, which is that nobody I see does that. The reason I think is that you really benefit a lot from having some kind of anchor point somewhere with your right hand, especially if you're playing live. Maybe you're moving around on stage, which is something I do a lot. You need to have some stability, otherwise you're not going to find your strings when you need them. And finding strings when you need them is a really good thing to do with your right hand if you want to pluck notes. Okay, so the floating hand thing, where you might be anchored with your forearm, but maybe even not. Out of all the videos I watched doing research for this video, the only time I saw anyone doing that was Geddy Lee from Rush for a second, playing some notes on the low E string. And I saw him do that, and I was like, oh yeah, I do that too, but only live, only for show, not when I actually need to perform something difficult. Because I'm sure if you kept watching that video, you watch Geddy go like this, as soon as he needs to really play some notes, he's going to anchor that thumb, because it gives you the stability and consistency to get the accuracy you need. Okay, so the static anchor and the floating hand technique, I think we can just kind of throw out of the discussion of optimal bass techniques that are actually used by professionals, which leads us to the floating thumb Gary Willis technique discussion. Now we get to the most controversial part of this discussion, which is talking about Gary Willis's floating thumb technique. Okay, so again, we're talking about a very straight wrist, and the thumb is kind of following the plucking fingers as they cross the strings. Now, there's some other components to Gary Willis's technique, which I'll talk about in a minute here, but we're just talking about the basic thumb approach here. So one of the big stated advantages of this technique that Gary talks about a lot is the wrist angle, because when you're using the traditional movable anchor technique, you can get a really intense bend in your wrist like this. You know, say I have my thumb on the pickup, I'm playing on the E string, and I have my elbow dropped all the way down, my forearm's resting on the bass. Well, now I've got almost like an 80-degree angle in my wrist here, you know, measuring from here as 0. It's about something like 75 or 80 degrees, which can be a bad thing. It can lead to carpal tunnel syndrome and just pain and bad stuff happening. So one of the things Gary Willis promotes as an advantage of his technique is that you keep a very straight wrist. And you still have some stability from the thumb anchoring to the strings as you go along. So this is not an anchorless technique. So anyway, one of the big advantages of it is that it's easy to keep a really straight wrist while you do the technique. However, it's possible to do the movable anchor technique and keep a relatively straight wrist, which you'll probably see if you watch me playing throughout this video. Sometimes I have a pretty bent wrist. Part of that is just because I'm sitting here talking to you, not playing very actively. So if I'm just playing a few notes, it doesn't really bother me to have my wrist bent. However, a lot of times, especially if you see me live, you'll see I move my shoulder and my elbow around and also change the angle of my thumb anchor. And that allows me to get more like a 10 or 20 degree angle in my wrist rather than the 80-degree angle, which definitely can lead to carpal tunnel syndrome and stuff like that down the road. Although, even having some bad habits in the past, I've never experienced anything like that after over a decade of playing, but certainly some people do, and you don't want to experience anything like that. It would be such a huge bummer. So my point here is that there are ways to get a relatively straight wrist doing the movable anchor technique, so the floating thumb technique isn't the only way to reduce your risk of carpal tunnel syndrome and other issues like that. So to me, there are a few reasons why this floating thumb technique does not replace the movable anchor traditional fingerstyle technique. The first reason is that I feel that it works a lot better in some styles of music than others, while the movable anchor feels really versatile to me. So what I mean here is that if you listen to Gary Willis talk at length about the technique, you'll also hear him talking about using a light touch with the right hand, meaning to, you know, say that on a scale of 1 to 10, you're playing an average like a 2 or a 3 or a 4 intensity with your right hand, which gives you a lot of dynamic range and headroom above your kind of average dynamic, and then you use the amp to get extra volume. And for me, playing a lot of different styles of music, I find that that works really well for some styles like the jazz, fusion, funk kind of stuff that Gary Willis is known for. But for me, on a more aggressive rock gig, using the soft light touch just doesn't cut it. It doesn't get the right sound. It's not a volume issue, it's an intensity issue. And so for me, my feeling, again, this is my subjective bias on this particular point, not being great with the technique, just kind of feeling around with it, I feel like it's harder for me to get a really aggressive tone than with the floating thumb than with the movable anchor. And again, if you look at professional bass players in rock bands who are using their fingers and not using a pick, you're going to see them using this movable anchor technique. And to me, again, this is my subjective feeling on this, it's easier for me to get a really aggressive sound out of my bass using the movable anchor technique than the floating thumb. So if you're interested in playing aggressive kinds of styles of music, that's something you might want to consider. The second reason I don't think that the floating thumb replaces the movable anchor is that it's not as flexible for switching to other techniques like slap and tapping, which are both things that Gary Willis doesn't really do, to my knowledge, certainly not the slap bass. So when your hand is positioned like this for the floating thumb, for me to get in position for slap bass, I've got to bring my elbow pretty far down and change my whole arm angle to get my thumb pointing slightly above parallel. Then I have to get all the way back here for fingerstyle, versus if I'm doing movable anchor, so again, there's a little subjectivity here. I'm used to switching from movable anchor back to my slap technique back and forth, but it just feels like more of a shift than from the movable anchor. But you can see I don't have to change my thumb angle that much to bounce back and forth from slap position to plucking position versus with the movable anchor. I mean with the floating thumb, sorry. I should be clear on the terminology of all people. See how much more movement there is versus. So having some flexibility to get to your slap and tap stuff is a reason that I think the movable anchor works a little better. My last little point here is another thing about Gary Willis's technique besides the thumb is that he uses a relatively complex 3-finger plucking system. And I think this may be a pretty important part of having this thumb angle that he recommends too, because having the 3rd finger there in for the plucking, whereas normal bass finger style is just the index and middle, it gives you more reach towards your higher strings. And if you don't have that 3rd finger in the mix, which a lot of people don't have a 3-finger plucking technique, it might be hard to get from your E string to your G string accurately. Whereas if you're using the movable anchor technique, you can kind of hover yourself more over the strings. So you just do a slight pivot to get from the E to the G string. Whereas if you've got a straight wrist and you're back here on your E string, you've got to kind of slide your whole arm forward to get to the G string. And for me, doing the pivot is a lot easier than having to slide my hand down. I feel like it gives me a lot more repeatable accuracy and stability to pivot like that than to have to slide back and forth. Okay, so as you can hear, there's a lot of subjectivity in all of these variables. Nevertheless, as a professional bass player, I've been playing and teaching for over a decade. This is the technique that I've been using, the movable anchor. This is what I've taught my students, and it's what's used by 90+% of famous bass players. So I really recommend, if you're a beginner, that you learn the movable anchor technique. And then if you want to learn Gary Willis's whole right hand approach with the 3 fingers, the floating thumb, the light touch, the ramp too, that's another part of Gary Willis's approach, then you can. But you're never going to regret the time you spent working on the movable anchor technique, because again, it's just a tried and true technique in the sense that it's very caters to any type of performance in any genre, and famous bass players from all styles have been using this. And also because of the relative complexity of Gary Willis's approach, I would be nervous to try to teach it to a beginner. I think it would be overwhelming. So if you're a beginner, I really recommend that you learn the movable anchor, and I will do another video where I'll show you that technique in more detail. And I'll also talk about some of the nuances and refinements I didn't talk about in this video if you're more intermediate or advanced. So if you're already doing the movable anchor technique, I hope that you won't feel that you're doing the wrong technique just because people argue some of the benefits of Gary Willis's technique. And am I saying Gary Willis is doing the wrong thing with his right hand? Of course not. And in fact, there's a lot of other bass players who have unique right hand approaches. Matt Garrison has a really interesting thumb, ring, middle, index alternating approach that I haven't practiced in a long time. Billy Sheehan has like 3 or 4 different plucking techniques. He'll do 2 fingers, he'll do 3-finger alternating, he'll do 4-finger alternating, pinky, ring, middle, index. Who else? Dominique DiPiazza. You might not have heard of him as much, but he's got a really fascinating right hand with thumb plucks and stuff. So there's a lot of other bass players with really innovative right hand techniques, and I use some of those techniques too. But it seems like we're all talking about Gary Willis's technique more, and I think this might just be because he's a more popular bass instructor than some of those other bass players I mentioned. He's had instructional materials out for a long time, so people talk about his technique. And I certainly don't discourage you from learning it if you want to, but like I said, I feel it may not be versatile enough to replace the movable anchor for some styles of bass playing. Okay, so what can we learn from this whole discussion, whether you agree with my recommendation or not, which is fine. First thing that occurs to me is that there's a point at which it gets pretty silly to try to name every right hand approach. We named 4 of them in this video. We mostly discussed movable anchor and the floating thumb, but there are so many slight variations available in these techniques. Whether you move your thumb all the way to the A string sometimes with your movable anchor, or whether you only do pick up an E string, or whether you tend to gravitate here or here or here, which again I'll talk about in the movable anchor video. There's just so many slight variations, and then just your wrist angle, your elbow angle, your shoulder angle, your strap height, okay, that has a big effect, your body type, your body shape, just your finger length. There's so many variables that make up each person's technique. Even if they all look similar, everybody's technique is going to be a little bit different. So first of all, that makes it a little bit silly to try to name 10 different ways of doing fingerstyle when they're all 5% different from each other. And also, it just gets really silly to say that one technique is right and one technique is wrong. And I hope it didn't come across like I'm saying that Gary Willis's approach is wrong for him to do, obviously, but also for you to do if that's what you feel drawn to, especially if the movable anchor, you've been doing it for years and it's not feeling good, you might want to play with an alternate right hand approach. So part of the reason I want to get you out of the right-wrong thinking is that my experience hanging out with a lot of beginners and bass students, and also hanging out with some professional musicians and some really high-level, like A-list professional musicians, is that beginners and intermediate bass students talk about what's the right technique, what's the wrong technique, what's the best one, which one's better than other ones, in sort of a value judgment sort of way. And what professionals do is they use technique as a tool to achieve a musical end. So I encourage you to just get in that mindset. You don't have to be famous to have that mindset. But this is how successful bass players think about their technique, is it's just a way to get some music out. So maybe we can define the right technique as the technique that best gets you the musical results that you're looking for without causing you pain. So whether you get that by getting the really straight wrist with the Gary Willis technique, or just being mindful with your wrist when you're doing the movable anchor, it's all about functionality and results. It's not about, oh, I know the right technique, I'm cooler than you, blah, 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 blah. The last takeaway I want to give you here is that you don't have to pick one technique and stick with it forever, okay? You could do movable anchor and the floating thumb depending on the musical context. It's totally up to you. I just want to present a simple option for beginners, which is to just learn the movable anchor for now. But if you watch me live, I change between a bunch of different right-hand techniques, even just for normal fingerstyle plucking. I'll do 2-finger plucking, I'll do 3-finger plucking occasionally, sometimes I'll do 1-finger plucking, sometimes I'll pluck with my thumb, I might palm mute with my thumb, I might float my whole hand, I might reach around my bass like this. There's a lot of stuff that goes into live performance that's not necessarily about just doing your one efficient technique. And even if it is, you can do a lot of movement and variation within your technique just to keep a flow when you're playing for a long time. So it's not about finding the exact correct parameters for your technique every time in a dogmatic way. It's about functionality, keeping your body pain-free, and getting the musical results that you want. So I hope that you've gotten a lot out of this video. Whether you agree with my recommendation or not, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd be happy to hear them. And thank you for listening.